Welcome back everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course we continue our preparation for the Linux Foundation Certified System Administration exam. So in our last video for HTTP services, we installed and configured the Squid proxy server. A proxy server is something that intercedes between a client and external requests made over various protocols, HTTP, HTTPS, etc., so that that client is abstracted from the request, meaning that from a server perspective, a request that comes to, for example, CNN.com from a client that is using a Squid proxy server will appear as if the IP address of the client making the request is the IP of the Squid proxy server itself rather than the IP of the client. If you've used Tor or any other anonymizing web browser, that's effectively what's happening, is that you're using a proxy to abstract your identity, your IP address, and your browser traffic from the place that you're making the request to. It's also a useful way of keeping certain networks under control. In other words, they can't browse the internet because the ACL, as we saw earlier in the configuration, excludes certain networks. We can also add more granular controls so that we have certain protocols that can't be used, for example, from work. So if I didn't want to be able to use HTTPS for some reason, I could disallow in the ACL of the ports that are allowed to be proxied from that configuration. But how do I set up a client to do it? So we know from our last video during the setup that we have the Squid service running on this particular server. And our IP address is 192.168.1.90. So what we're going to do is we're going to configure Firefox, which has a very easy proxy configuration in it for web browsing. And then we'll look at how it's identified from within the Squid proxy server. So if we minimize our connection here and we go to a web browser page, of course we can go to CNN.com from within our Firefox web browser. Now, if we go up and go to the tools or Firefox preferences, in the preferences under advanced, in the network area, there's a section for configuring how Firefox connects to the internet. We're going to go to settings here. We're going to tell it to use a manual proxy configuration. Now, if we've configured our entire system through some environment variable or configuration file that Firefox can pick up, we could use a system proxy setting, or if we were broadcasting a proxy configuration, we could auto-detect the proxy setting for the network. However, in this case, we're going to manually indicate what we want to do, and we want to indicate that 192.168.1.90 on port 3128, and we want to use this proxy for all server protocols. So the three that you're going to find the most is SSL, FTP, and SOCKS. We could also do remote DNS if we wanted to, which would keep us from making any DNS calls that look like they were coming from us, rather. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK here, and we'll close this. And now we'll go to google.com. And google.com will come up just like it did before. So let's find out what IP address do we have on this system. I know it's on the 192 network, so we'll do an ifconfig and we'll grep for 192. So we're on 192.168.1.75. So let's bring back up our server and let's find out what it looks like on a logging file for this particular connection. So if we go to our var log directory, there's also a squid directory that has an access log and a squid guard log. But what we want is we want the access log. So if we cat the access log out, we'll see that our client IP, and if we look at our IP, grep eth0 ifconfig, which will tell us our IP is 1.90, so the server is 1.90. But if we cat out the access log, we can see that we're going to the google.com website from the client IP of 192.168.1.75. So all of these gets and posts that we know from the Squid server perspective came from this particular client IP. If you were to see the Google log files, those log files would actually be logging the request as if it came from the 1.190 address or whatever my external address happens to NAT to for this particular case. What you would normally use a proxy server for is something that is publicly available that you connect to, that again abstracts your client IP from your public Squid proxy server. It's a way of abstracting your traffic so that it's not identifiable either to a system, a user, or an IP address. And we can restrict that IP address much the same we did in the previous video, simply by telling it which IP ranges can connect to the Squid proxy server. Now, if we turn off the Squid service here without unconfiguring the proxy access for our client, let's see what happens. So if we do a service Squid stop, and Squid will actually take a fair amount of time, particularly the longer that it's been running, because it's flushing its caches. Because in addition to being a proxy, it can cache certain entries as well. So it's flushing all of those caches from disk. While this is happening, the Squid service at this point should be stopped. So if we minimize this window and go back to our web browser and try to go to CNN, for example, we should get an error message, and it says the proxy server is refusing connections. In order to fix that, we would have to go back to the preferences for our client, go to settings, and use no proxy. Once we turn off the proxy, then it should restore connectivity to our browser. Now our proxy server at this point should be stopped, and it is. If we do a PSAUX and grep for Squid, a Squid process has now stopped. So now we've configured our HTTP client to automatically use that proxy server for abstracting our traffic, going through the proxy server, hiding our IP and identity so that we have more granular control, and it can also protect the end user client from having its IP address or cookies or anything else exposed to external entities. That's all there is for configuring your HTTP client to use a Squid proxy server. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.